is Jeff Hunt. I'm a master's conducting student here at James Madison University. And this recital, along with the accompanying research paper, serve as the capstone to my master's degree in choral conducting. I'm excited to present my findings on the infusion of narrative elements into choral repertoire, as well as perform Jake Runestad's American Triptych, a contemporary masterwork. I know I can speak for the performing ensembles, the Madison Singers, and the JMU Chorale, that this music has touched us deeply, and we are excited to sing it for you tonight. And I want to thank them for sharing their mid-semester concert with me. A big thank you to those as well tuning in over the live stream. It means the world to me and to the singers that those who are far away can still enjoy this music with us. The title of my presentation is Come to the Woods, Discovering Narrative Form Through the Choral Compositional Style of Jake Runestad's American Triptych. The purpose of my research and analysis is to bring to light the narrative elements Runestad infuses into his compositions, which derive from the powerful words of past and contemporary American naturalist writers. The presentation will include an overview of the idea of narrative elements in prose and poetry, a brief look at the life and work of composer Jake Runestad, a short summary of the three naturalists whose writings inspired the American Triptych, specific narrative elements present in each of the three movements, and finally, a presentation of each movement. Dubbed a choral rock star by American public media, Jake Runestad is a contemporary choral composer who has achieved international recognition in the last several years for his imaginative compositions, many of which feature poignant, thoughtful texts from the great writers of both today and yesteryear. He's known for his soaring melodies, lush harmonies, and careful attention to text. In spite of being only 33 years old, Runestad has achieved a level of fandom in the choral world that few ever reach, and typically not until later in life. As I read and listened to more and more of his compositions, I came to find that Runestad heavily incorporates storytelling elements in his music. The three movements which make up Runestad's American Triptych were originally composed as three separate works. Commissioned in 2013 by the Young New Yorkers chorus, the piece of Wild Things was written first. Of the composition, Runestad said that because of the hustle and bustle of that never-sleeping city, he wanted to provide the singers with some respite, who were so seldom able to get out into the wilderness. Come to the Woods was composed next, commissioned in 2015 by Craig Hella Johnson's choir, Conspirare, while the last piece composed was Reflections, commissioned in 2016 by Josh Haberman for the Santa Fe Desert Chorale. When I interviewed Jake Runestad in September of last year, he told me that once all three had been finished, he realized that he had these three individual pieces which dealt with similar subject matter. They came from three prominent American naturalists and included the same musical forces, mixed choir and piano. So he decided to combine them into a larger work aptly titled American Triptych. Narrative has deep historical ties to vocal music. Some of the earliest examples of which we're aware, the ancient Greeks performing comedies and tragedies accompanied by music, the French trouvères of the 10th century singing epic poems. Musicians have incorporated storytelling through song in madrigals, in opera, in musical theater, in folk music, and in rock and roll. A great deal of scholarship has been dedicated to these art forms. The research about narrative in contemporary choral music, however, is relatively sparse and merits research and discussion because of the positive effect it can have on the composition, interpretation, and meaningful performance of the choral music. My research into narrative elements in choral compositions actually came after choosing the music for this recital. I was familiar with Jake Runestad's choral music, but last summer I came across his American Triptych and absolutely fell in love with it. My wife and I are both avid outdoors people. We love to hike, camp, and just generally get out into the wilderness. But when I heard these three pieces, they speak with a passion and a reverence about the outdoors that spoke to me instantly. As I became more and more familiar with the triptych and the authors of its texts, I began to see story elements woven throughout. Now, the idea of narrative through music is, of course, a massive field, and this study will scarcely scratch the surface. The Oxford Dictionary of Literary Terms defines narrative as a telling of some true or fictitious event or series of events. In each of the three movements of American Triptych, that story takes a different form, and a new element of storytelling is brought to the foreground. The specific elements on display in the triptych are setting, defined as the time and place in which the story occurs; characterization, defined as the representation of persons in the narrative; tone, defined as the mood or atmosphere of a work; and plot points, defined as the events which make up a story, which relate to each other in a pattern or sequence. The texts of the three movements of the triptych come from three prominent American naturalist writers, a naturalist being an expert in the field of natural history. The naturalists, Henry David Thoreau, Wendell Berry, and John Muir, hail from different sectors of the United States, and they write about different natural landscapes through poetry and prose. In the first movement, Thoreau describes a calm lake in Massachusetts, while in the second, Berry describes the Kentucky wilderness, and in the third, Muir adventures through the Sierras in California. Two of the naturalists, Thoreau and Muir, lived and published their works in the mid-19th century, while Berry is alive today and is a contemporary writer who's 85. In our interview, Runestad told me that he attempts to invoke the very essence of a writer through his compositions, capturing their voice and giving their written word increased potency through melody and rhythm. He went further to say that he thought it disingenuous not to consider the character of a writer before using their words to compose a piece of music, which is why Runestad's musical output features the texts of such great writers as Thoreau, Berry, Muir, William Shakespeare, and Sarah Teasdale. When I interviewed him as part of my research, he said, "What I try to do is, with all my pieces, I try to create a painting. I try to create something that encapsulates a story or an emotion and allows us to live in that moment when we hear it." My research into his music bore that out. Runestad both incorporates narrative elements such as setting, characterization, tone, and plot points throughout his compositions. He also represents them musically. The basic elements of a story on display in American Triptych are these: setting and characterization, tonal arc, and plot points. The first movement, Reflections, demonstrates the power of setting and provides a three-dimensional look at the author of the text. The second movement, The Piece of Wild Things, takes the listener on a journey from darkness to light, through various compositional methods. And the last movement, Come to the Woods, tells the story point by point of an outdoorsman getting caught in a thunderstorm and climbing a tree for a better look. Each of these movements is engaging and impactful in its own right, but taken as a whole, American Triptych is a masterclass in incorporating narrative elements in choral compositions. I'd like to begin this exploration of narrative elements in the first movement of American Triptych, Reflections, as Runestad did, with an overview of the source of the text. The text of Reflections comes from the journal of Henry David Thoreau. He stands as one of the most celebrated authors of his generation, though he published primarily essays and only a handful of books. The ideas he presents still serve as inspiration for change makers today. Thoreau was also one of the most prominent contributors to American literature and a leader in the Transcendentalist movement, whose philosophy centered on the inherent goodness and wisdom inside humans and in nature. They believed that a person could learn as much through introspection as by reading a textbook. In 1845, Thoreau spent 2 years at a dwelling he built by Walden Pond, an experience which served as the creative impetus for his now famous book, Walden. This was an experiment in transcendentalism, to see whether life was made full by filling it with a job, or whether a life of quiet contemplation could provide greater self-actualization. He saw the drudgery of a life almost entirely devoted to wage work, and he hypothesized that life could be more fulfilling if greater emphasis were placed on solitude, meditation, and nature. And the same tenets are true in the first movement of the American Triptych, Reflections, which draws its text from Thoreau's journals and explores the question of what constitutes a life fully lived. The story elements on display in the first movement is characterization, showing in detail the two sides of Thoreau. The first half of Reflections represents the side of the author which was feverishly involved with the goings-on of his day, fighting ardently for the abolition of slavery, participating in the Underground Railroad, supporting early feminism, and giving frequent speeches and lectures on these and other topics. The term I used with the choir to describe this sort of zest for living is Lebenslust, which, translated from German, means the love of life. In this first movement, the tenors and basses begin by singing quickly, often loudly, repeating the text, "We live but a fraction of our life." As the choir progresses through the piece and continues to repeat that text, you'll notice a distinct and somewhat abrupt shift in the compositional style about halfway through. The second half of this movement, in stark contrast to the first, is slow and thoughtful, never rising above a mezzo-piano dynamic. The second section represents the side of Thoreau which sought to put transcendentalism into practice, living self-sufficiently by the shore of Walden Pond for 2 years, spending almost all of his time in quiet contemplation and observation of nature, and only rarely interacting with other people. Although there is recent scholarship to suggest that about weekly he went home to do some laundry at his mother's house. Distinct from the energetic first half, I described this second section to the singers with words such as serenity and introspection. The binary form of this movement also points to two distinct settings, which are referenced in the articulation of the sheet music and confirmed when I interviewed the composer. The first section, with its kinetic energy, use of polyphony, and ever-flowing piano accompaniment, feels like a fast-moving river, churning and crashing past rocks and round bends. The second half, in stark contrast, takes the listener to the side of a calm lake, as indicated in the music, which prompts the piano to play delicately like still water, and for the choir to sing sweetly serene. Before bringing out the choir to demonstrate these musical examples, I'll also introduce the narrative concepts embedded into the second movement as well, both of which will then be performed by the JMU chorale. The text for the piece of Wild Things, the second movement of American Triptych, comes from the poet, activist, and Kentucky native Wendell Berry. After retiring from teaching creative writing at the University of Kentucky in Lexington, Berry purchased a farm near his natal home in Henry County, Kentucky, which he tends with his wife and 2 sons to this day. Berry has long been an activist both through his writing and his actions, speaking out against the war in Vietnam, the use of nuclear power and fossil fuels, the death penalty, and federal overreach into the agricultural sector. More than all else, however, Berry is interested in protecting the land, specifically as it pertains to agriculture. His poem begins with a deep-rooted concern for the welfare of the world that his children will inherit. The author finds peace, however, in nature, commenting that wild things do not tax their lives with forethought of grief, and comes to feel rest in the grace of the world. The story of the Piece of Wild Things is that a departure out of fear and despair that worldly cares bring, and into the peace and grace which can only be felt in the beauty of nature. This narrative occurs throughout the music, guiding the listener from despair into peace, in the tempo and dynamics, and in the articulation and tonal centers. The brief examples you'll hear from these movements represent only a small portion of the total number of narrative elements in the work. It is my hope that these examples will serve as an auditory landmark in the presentation of each movement. I present these and other elements in much further detail in the paper that will accompany this presentation, so if you feel like a long, very interesting read, contact me afterward and you can carve out a couple hours to read my paper. In order to demonstrate for you the narrative elements we have been exploring in the first two movements, please help me welcome to the stage the JMU Chorale and their collaborative pianist, Amy Robertson. Those at the end of the line, greatly appreciate you clapping all the way to the end. The first example you'll hear will be from the piano. From the onset of this movement, the piano embarks on what Runestad refers to as a bustling opening section, with quickly alternating, overlapping open fifths, conjuring a river flowing and racing downhill. These dancing sextuplets are marked energetic in the score and continue for 27 measures, providing a lively backdrop for the singers. Next, you'll hear a distinct shift in the character of the piano from the second half of Reflections. While accompanying the voices by the side of the calm lake, the piano converts to a thin, single line of arpeggiated eighth notes, flowing from low to high in a sequence of fifths. As for the voices, the excitement of the first half is most on display during measures 39 to 49, during which the voices polyphonically repeat the text, "We live but a fraction of our life," a total of 15 times, filling every possible moment with a new, unique iteration of that musical idea. Runestad writes very few breaks in the voices, creating a non-stop flow of music and energy. The second half of Reflections in Contrast uses a more subdued dynamic range, staying below mezzo-piano during the entire second half, and growing ever softer until the end of the piece. The tempo is much slower as well, with a number of ritardandos written into the score, making the character of this second half thoughtful and unhurried, just as Thoreau living a life of quiet observation and writing by Walden Pond. Of particular note is the soprano and alto entrance at measure 56, whose melodic contour and rhythm mirror forward and backward as well as vertically across voice parts, creating a musical palindrome. Moving now to examples from the piece of Wild Things. The overarching idea in this second movement is that of tonal shift from darkness to light, or despair to peace. Runestad is explicit in his articulation markings, indicating the first entrance of each of the voices should be dark. The music sounds in E minor, which supports the dour mood of the text, and the first voices to sing the words of Barry's poetry are the basses, the lowest and often darkest voice part in the choir. As this movement transitions into peace, the music takes on a lighter, more positive timbre, and the music directs the voices to sing brighter. The tempo picks up substantially, and in the peace section, the dynamic steadily rises until reaching its apex, the voices singing fortissimo, before gradually dying away in the piece's denouement. As the movement comes to a close, the sopranos sing the final phrase, a mirror image to the bass's low voices at the beginning of the piece, another example of reflective writing by Runestad. In the following example, you'll hear the elevated dynamic level, faster tempo, and brighter tone production from the choir. Having heard numerous examples from these two movements and been introduced to narrative elements found in each, you can now experience these pieces with increased understanding. You will hear the binary form of reflections, which evokes contrasting settings of a bustling river and a calm lake, followed by the massive shift in tone and mood in the piece of Wild Things, from the tempo and dynamics to the voicing and vowel coloration. Please enjoy the first two movements of American Triptych. The third and final movement of Runestad's American Triptych is Come to the Woods, whose text comes from John Muir. John Muir was a Scottish-American naturalist, explorer, conservationist, and a prolific writer. From an early age, Muir yearned to learn about the world around him, but he was not permitted by his father to read any book other than the Bible. He would, however, on occasion steal away from time to time and would read literature from Shakespeare and Milton. As he reached adulthood, he broke out on his own to study at the University of Wisconsin at Madison, taking courses in geology, botany, and natural history, though he lacked a clear vision for what he intended to do with this knowledge. He ended up terminating his studies without a degree, trading, in his words, one university for another, the University of Wisconsin for the University of the Wilderness. The ensuing decades of Muir's life include adventures too numerous to recount in this short introduction. But suffice it to say that John Muir was a free spirit who loved the outdoors and wrote extensively about his findings in the wilderness. In the summer of 1868, Muir worked as a shepherd in the high Sierras, during which he penned My First Summer in the Sierra, from which Runestad pulled the lyrics for Come to the Woods. The text describes an adventure Muir had during a particularly fierce thunderstorm. Muir, on a whim, climbed a Douglas fir tree for a wider look at the storm. The music in Come to the Woods follows a typical story arc, increasing in harmonic tension as the thunderstorm picks up. The music reaches its zenith as Muir clings to his tree, the wind bending and swirling backwards and forwards, round and round. And then after the storm dies away, a supreme calm is felt in the text as well as in the piano and the voices. Come to the Woods is a fantastic example of storytelling through music, and like every good story, it utilizes repeating thematic material throughout the piece. This particular story is built on 8 distinct musical themes, which constitute nearly all the musical material in the movement. I divided the themes into 2 categories, structural and localized. Structural motives occur typically once at a time in at least 2 places throughout the piece, while localized motives occur 2 or more times in immediate succession in just one section of the piece. The characters of this narrative are the 8 structural and localized motives which follow a basic story arc, seen here. The rising action of the story is felt as these motives appear and reappear, and with each repetition increase in harmonic density. Runestad uses this compositional device to draw the listener through the events of the story, gradually increasing the narrative and harmonic tension until finally the moment of the storm arrives and the piece reaches its climax before moving into falling action and resolution. The clearest example of the increasing musical tension and rising action is in the first structural theme of the movement, which repeats several times throughout the piece. In order to demonstrate this narrative element, please welcome to the stage the Madison Singers. The piece opens with the most basic and diatonic iteration of theme 1, followed immediately by a more harmonically dense repetition. The next two iterations of theme 1 continue to increase in harmonic density as the story progresses. In the repetitions you just heard, the dynamic or the harmonic density increases as the rising action of the piece takes off. Then at the end of the piece, the sopranos sing one final repetition of this theme. These repetitions would end on harmonically unstable chords, while this final iteration of theme 1 sees the sopranos returning to the home tone, which symbolizes resolution of the story. As we prepare to conclude this recital with a performance of the last movement of American Triptych, I want to take a moment to thank the many individuals who have helped me to arrive at this point of this recital. First, I want to thank my faculty advisors, Dr. Vandervat Kromi and Dr. Hayes. You've taught me so much, both through direct instruction and by example, and your positive influence will be felt throughout my career. I want to thank the Madison singers and the JMU Chorale, as well as their collaborative pianists, Amy Robertson and Haley Griffith, for sharing their mid-semester concert with me and for bringing this beautiful music to life. Also, thanks to the Forbes Center staff and volunteers for your tireless work behind the scenes. You always make us look and sound wonderful. I want to thank my friends and family who have supported me throughout my career in schooling, especially here tonight, in person and on the live stream. And finally, I want to thank my dear wife, Sarah, for the many long nights she helped me preparing for this performance, the hours she has spent editing my writing, for being my rock, and for being my home. I truly believe I couldn't have done it without you. And if you see Sarah after the concert, please tell her what a fabulous job she did on the poster for the recital. Thank you for coming, and we will conclude this lecture recital with the Madison Singers presenting the third and final movement of the American Triptych, Come to the Woods.
Glorious day. Thank you.